friends, before we get into this episode, I want to tell you that we are covering some heavy subjects that may be a little mature for younger listeners. We're going to be talking about human trafficking. So if this is triggering for you, feel free to use your own discretion on whether or not to listen. This topic is very important for Christians to be aware of and is very near and dear to our hearts at Flourish Ministry. There will be links in the show notes for resources that you can explore to dig deeper. We hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to Flipping Tables, where we bring all of our religious thinking to Jesus, who flips the table for his upside-down kingdom. I'm Julie Sexton, and I'll be your host. Welcome to Season 3, Episode 2. Friends, in case you don't know, January is National Human Trafficking Prevention Month. Being an advocate for survivors is an area of both calling and passion for me. And for this episode, I took a short road trip to Grange, Kentucky, which is not far from my home in Lexington, to sit at a table with Dr. Jeanne Allert. Jeanne is the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute for Survivor Care. Jeanne, I am honored to be sitting in your office with you, having a place at your table. Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
Thank you. So I have to tell you, last year, I think it was early in 2024, I was at an event with my Refuge for Women team, and we were at Southeast. And my executive director, she's like tugging on my arm, and she goes, "That is Jeanne." And I said, "Okay." And she rattles off, and she begins to just feel this twinkle in her eyes about you. And she was just so sweet. And she I realized, like, oh my goodness, I need to know who this woman is. And I am in the presence of someone that you look up to, that you highly respect. So I feel like I'm in the presence of a giant today.
Oh my goodness. And I'm just kind of a tiny little thing.
No, I don't think so. I think, there's a book that Sharon McMahon wrote recently called The Small and Mighty.
Very good.
So it's about women and men who are kind of go under the radar, but they're actually really mighty. And I think that's who you are. I think you're one of those women.
You know, I have found over the years that there's great strength in, first of all, not seeking your own, right? And that adage of you can get a lot done if you don't care who gets the credit.
Yeah.
But the work of working with survivors over the last almost 20 years has been the most remarkable, humbling experience. So if I did have a braggadocious nature before, it was wrought out of me in the work, because you really, you see, I have learned an awful lot about my own nature and through them, about what really it means to be alongside and compassionate with somebody else, and that posture is just so different. So I bet if you could meet my high school colleagues, they would say she wasn't like that in high school.
Really? Yeah. Well, we do grow and we change, and the Lord forms us and molds us into people that he can use, and people who are humbled to be used by him and just deeply grateful. You are a pioneer in this field, though. You entered into this calling when not a lot of people were saying yes to it.
That's correct. Yeah. And I didn't know what I was saying yes to. That was back in 2007 when the Lord was moving in my life to leave my whole corporate life behind. And I always say that he rescued me from affluence and threw me into this work. And there was a pretty long season of saying, what am I doing here? I don't belong here. I'm an internet consultant in Washington, D.C. What the heck? And, the why me that some of us go through. But after a while, it became much more clear that things like my capacity to work with systems proved to be really helpful in working with people, because I could sometimes be more objective about all of the hard things you're listening to and think of it as, okay, it's a problem, Jeanne. Just think of it as a problem, or it's a mess, just clean it up. Instead of getting too tossed about by the emotionality of the work.
So you touched on a little bit about your career. Can you talk a little bit about your education? Because I know I think you have everything but a law degree.
That doesn't mean that isn't coming.
Really?
Oh yeah, I think about that a lot. Yeah, it's funny because I'm 62 and I grew up in the era where my grandmother thought, well, you're going to be a teacher or a nurse, right? Because that's what girls do.
Right.
And so I became a teacher for a while. So I got a degree in English and then a degree in education. But then I was going through quite a spiritual transformation in my life and ended up going to seminary. So got a degree in that. And then when I got thrown into the anti-trafficking field, there was so much that I wanted more to understand about what victims were suffering that I went and got a PhD in psychology, specializing in trauma. But law's always hanging on the outside, so it's funny you should mention that.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of a natural advocate position that would be really helpful, I'm sure.
Sure.
Not that you could almost like govern an entire little town, a little community.
Well, I tease about it now reflectively. You get to a certain age, you look back and you say, I remember, when you take those little personality tests when you're in, middle school, junior high, whatever. And they say, well, based on your personality, you would either be a teacher, a counselor, or clergy. And I say, well, gosh, I must have never heard the or. Just decided that those all sound fun. Let's do them all.
Yeah, you decided to take it all on. I used to work for a doctor who had 5 kids, and he said, I need one of them to be a teacher, one of them to be a pastor, one of them to be a lawyer, one of them to be a doctor. And I don't remember what the other position was, but I said, are you trying to found a town around your family where and it's interesting, but they took it to heart, kind of like you did with your test. And that's what they all became.
Yeah, I can't say it was by intention. Each thing was sort of what was presented to me at the time and make whatever is the next best move. I do think that law would be interesting because the more that we understand about the issue of human trafficking, we as Christians, of course, see it as a moral problem. We see it as a sin problem, but we also have to hold at the same time the fact that it's a crime.
Yeah.
And we can't deviate from that. We can't sway one side or the other. We have to keep in mind this is a legal issue. Mm-hmm. And so that's where we, as those engaged in this work, can't divorce ourselves from governance, politics, legal, advocacy. They have to be held one in each hand,
right,
in order to do it well. So we have a group of attorneys, Christian attorneys across the country that work with us, and that's been very helpful.
Yeah, I'm sure it has been. And like you said, there is not one area of expertise cannot meet all the needs and the demands.
Correct.
That this very complex issue is founded around. So it sounds to me like God has just taken all of these skill sets and passions and has just molded you into a person who can do a lot of things. I would compare you to like a Moses, how God prepared Moses for the position that he's in. And I know we don't like to be compared to like a spiritual giant like that, but yeah, I just I have a lot of respect for you.
Well, thank you. If I have to pick somebody in Scripture, I would say dispositionally, I'm probably more like Peter.
Oh, Peter.
Because Peter will step out on the waves and he'll cut your ear off.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty much right in there.
I am too. I always say that I want to be like John, but I'm really more like Peter. I do have a podcast called Flipping Tables, so that kind of tells you how my personality goes.
For sure.
So, well, I would love to. You told a story on a podcast that I listened to that you were on, and about being a little girl in Bangkok. Can you tell that story?
Yes, I was raised primarily as a young child over in Bangkok, Thailand, and it was a fantastic way of growing up. And I think the preamble to the story is that, sometimes you have these experiences that you don't know are significant until much later in life. And that was true in this particular situation because I think I was about 7 or 8 years old. And at that time, we were in the beach community, Pattaya Beach, and my parents were very liberal with us. You know, there was a great deal of trust. And so we could wander off and play and come back. And that was not as scary of a proposition as it is today. So I had wandered, but I had wandered perhaps a little too far. And remember going down this one particular street, and then like a child, you have that moment where you recognize, I'm lost. Right? You have that moment of panic. And as it happened, there were a bunch of women outside of this storefront, and they took notice of this little American girl. And, you know, we looked different.
Yeah.
And they were very doting, lovely, brought me inside. They were combing my hair, and they were, we didn't speak the same language, but they were obviously, from a child's point of view, they were being very kind to me. And the place was just full of pretty women. And so that's what I remember as a child. But then I remember that pivotal moment when, after, who knows, could have been a couple of hours, my parents come bursting through the front door of this establishment, and the look on my mother's face said to a child, you did something wrong, right? And you don't know what it is,
right?
But that's the way a child perceives it. And so they, you know, snatched me up, basically, and took me home, and all was well. And we didn't talk about it again until much, much later that I got more of the details that I had wandered into a district, and that was a brothel, and these were all prostituted women. And, you know, there were a couple of really big takeaways for me. One was, the most important perhaps, is, you know, there in a breath, my life could have gone in a completely different direction. I would have probably still ended up in trafficking, but maybe on the other side of this equation.
Yeah.
And so that's amazing how God kind of planted that as part of my narrative that wouldn't come into fullness until decades later. And then the other piece that I've probably spent more reflection on later is, I'm careful to now say, from the mind of a child. Because what I've had to understand, whether that's textbook psychology or whether that's sitting with survivors, is understanding that sometimes children have perceptions or make decisions or make bad moves that they don't know are bad moves, but they read the adults around them. And so did my mother say I'd done anything wrong? Not at all. So now I more viscerally understand when I have a survivor who says, you know, my daddy raped me every night, you know, from the age of 6 to 13, and it was my fault. And we as adults want to jump in and go, there's no way that's possible, right? Your dad's a beast and da-da-da-da-da. But from the mind of a child, it's too hard to imagine that the adult is erring. It's so much easier for the child to say, there must be something wrong with me. There must be something I've done. And so that really small and benign experience for me has just produced so much fruit in my better understanding and having empathy for some of the stories I've heard over the decades.
Do you think we outgrow that, or do you think that if we default back to a setting where, as an adult, where we go back to, this is my fault, I brought this on, are we going back to something that was formed in us as a child?
I think so. I think it also depends on what then at that moment gets affirmed, gets reinforced, right? If you happen to be in a household where the parent is, yes, you're a bad kid, right? Yes, you should be punished. You know, if I had gone home and my parents would have said, I can't believe you ran away, you could have really been hurt, you're going to be, right? And it was a punitive response, then maybe I would have taken that much more severe, and it would have anchored in me and in, wow, I am bad. I do bad things. And then you can see how that becomes a self-talk, right, in a child who then becomes an adolescent for whom, well, this is who I am. I'm a person who does bad things. And it can change a direction for an individual. So I do agree with you.
Yeah, I just wondered about that. I had kind of an experience in silence with the Lord in the fall, and I felt like one of the things that he did in me was he kind of took me back to some memories in my childhood. They weren't necessarily bad memories, but just showed me how they had formed, a perception of myself that had fed a narrative in my life.
Right.
And then he kind of gave me a vision of myself as a younger child and saying to me, like, this is how I see you. And so you will live and walk more in freedom with me if you know that when you default into that narrative, that's not how I see you. I see you as this little girl.
Right.
And it was really, really helpful and very, very healing for my soul. And so I think when you were talking, it just kind of brought that to the surface for me.
Well, and there is some literature that suggests that children form their worldview by age 8. And while we've spent a lot of energy focusing on adolescence as an identity phase, you think of Erik Erikson and stages of development, and how but that is more the self in relationship to others. But if a child as young as 8 years old is beginning to form a lens through which they see the world, I think it's interesting in the studies that we've done with the survivors we've served, on average, the onset of their sexual abuse in the home started at age 8. And so you can just see where that corrupts the formation of somebody's view of the world. With sexual abuse in particular, child sexual abuse, at a young age, that child learns secrecy, deception, right? And denying reality. I hurt. No, you don't. Right? I don't want this. Yes, you do. Right? So there is already a maligning, a corruption that happens with that physical abuse that forms a worldview that will unfortunately guide a lot of people's steps going forward.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to move into talking about children a little bit with you. Since we're already there, I was going to do it a little later in our conversation. But
we'll bounce around.
We'll bounce around. So we'll maybe circle back to that. But I want to talk about, you started off founding the Samaritan Woman in Baltimore.
Correct.
And that was around 2007. Am I remembering correctly? Again, you were a real trailblazer, a pioneer in this field, because there wasn't a lot in 2007.
The University of Illinois had identified 12 as the, so it was a very sparse landscape. And, frankly, I didn't know that finding other people who were doing the work was important. I was just so head down. And quite frankly, because I felt like I was sort of thrown into this, that I spent a lot of the early years just trying to figure it out, not really bubbling up, really in the trench going, okay, where am I and what am I supposed to do?
So
go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask, what was the moment? I know you had an encounter with a woman. Can you talk about that? Because people are probably listening, they're thinking, well, how did she even know to get into the trenches? What propelled you there?
It was a relationship with a person, an exploited individual. And the quick of the story was, here I was minding my own little business, running my consulting company and doing quite well with that. And I was out giving a speech. And after the speech, this guy came up to me and he said, in short, I didn't listen to anything you said, which is always flattering to a speaker. Right?
Wonderful news, yeah.
Exactly. But then he proceeds to tell me, the Lord spoke to me while you were talking and told me that I'm supposed to invite you on this outreach. Now, I'm going to tell you in full disclosure, I thought that is the lamest pickup line I think I've ever heard. Because I was like, I wasn't attuned to this idea of, you're here at a seminar. What do you mean the Lord's talking to you, right? So anyway, that's just now reflectively kind of funny since the Lord's talked to me a lot since then.
Yeah.
So this gentleman says, I believe that the Lord has told me to invite you on this street outreach. And I pushed it aside for a while and then eventually said, okay, I'm curious. Let me go. And it was transformational. This was a busload of Korean Presbyterians driving into downtown Baltimore. So you just have to imagine how odd that looked. And they were some of the most loving, kind, forward-facing with their faith kind of people. They would just jump out and interact with pimps and prostitutes and drug addicts. And, it was remarkable. It was probably the best example of, the gospel in shoe leather that I've ever seen. And I was captivated by them, so I kept going. Mm-hmm. And now I know that was a big setup. Now I know, because it was several months in after participating with them in that outreach that my encounter was to happen. And I was helping them with a little street carnival that we were doing. And there was a moment, I have to say, that it was like a movie scene where if you imagine sort of the hustle and bustle of a downtown New York type of thing, and then everything goes into freeze frame, mm-hmm. That's what it felt like. And there were a bunch of people in this downtown area. Everything stopped, and I could see this woman across the street and about a half a block down. And she was this 90 pounds, wet, stringy blonde hair, just nondescript waif of a girl, mm-hmm. who was stumbling her way down the street. And she just stood out from everyone. And I felt this overwhelming compulsion that I had to talk to her. And we ended up sitting on a stoop on Payson Avenue for 3 hours. Wow. And I learned a lot about Heather's life. And she needed somebody to talk to, and she needed a sandwich. Mm-hmm. And it was summer, and so we got her a milkshake and a burger, and we just sat there, and I just talked with her about anything she wanted to talk about. And in that 3-hour window, the Lord was rending my heart. Yeah. Right? He was just basically taking my heart and turning it into mashed potatoes. Mm-hmm. And so Heather is who he used to put flesh on a problem. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of it, we're in Human Trafficking Awareness Month, and that's great because we can look at statistics and we can look at reports and we can do all of that. But it really changes when it either hits home, mm-hmm. because the problem, addiction now is in my household, or whatever it is, pornography, etc. And so when it takes on flesh, mm-hmm. then it becomes something that we have to contend with. Right. And I went home and, kind of went into a tailspin of sort of figuratively shaking my fist going, God, do something. Yeah. Like, this is intolerable. This shouldn't be happening. Right? She was 14 years old. Mm-hmm. Right? She was seduced out of her single-parent household with that older man, and he trafficked her up and down the I-95 corridor for 4 years, and now she's addicted to, God knows what, and, now she's completely estranged from family, and so here I am railing. But any of us who have done that and shaken our fist realize that oftentimes what God's doing is just putting a big mirror in your face and saying, good, now you're listening.
I think that when Jesus was flesh, skin on the ground, here walking among people, I think that one of his things that he did with his disciples was he brought people into their lives that they would have never seen. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't have seen. Mm-hmm. And so God has to continue to do that with us. He has to put us in proximity to people where we can have a burger with them, sit and listen to their story and actually really see them. That's right. With all of our senses, mm-hmm. and experience that. And when you do that, you are changed. Yeah. Like, you kind of he hoodwinks us that way because you don't know, you have no idea that encounter, the path that it was going to put you on.
Well, and nor could I have anticipated that Heather and I would be friends to this day.
That's amazing.
And love her, connect with her, etc. Celebrate, her marriage and her child and all of those kinds of things. And so that's amazing. But the other aspect I would say is that from the very beginning, I now know that God was teaching me something about healing ministry that I will tell you, I've lost that lesson along the way several times. And the lesson fundamentally is the ministry of presence is the most healing agent that we could use. But we get distracted by what's your medical diagnosis and where are you in the DSM and are you on your meds and did you go to therapy and have you taken this and did you do this intervention and EMDR? We could go on and on and on forever. And I have not seen, by and large, those interventions have nearly the profound impact as somebody who is just willing to sit with you and say, I see you, I accept you, I'll walk with you. Mm-hmm. That is truly what's transformative. And that's not a Hallmark card. That is empirical evidence. I've got people who've been in my life, survivors who, clinicians, practitioners in other fields have perhaps done their level best tackling symptoms, mm-hmm. but not getting to the heart and soul of the person. And oftentimes, because we see such a high correlation between childhood sexual abuse and later exploitation, oftentimes you have to sit long enough to go back to that 8-year-old girl.
Right.
You have to sit long enough for that persona to emerge.
Yeah.
And to trust again before you can go forward. So that 3 hours on the stoop with Heather, I now know God was saying, I'm not asking you to have any special technique. Uh-huh. I am asking you to sit there and just be. It's been the most curative agent I've seen in 20 years.
That's really profound. I agree with you completely because that's been my experience too. I can read about something. I can be moved by something. The first time I remember hearing about human trafficking, not even the sexual exploitation side of it, just really the modern day slavery. And I just remember thinking, how can that even be happening mm-hmm. in our world? Mm-hmm. And then the sexual exploitation part of it, and I was like, I just don't know. I had all these myths and misunderstandings but it was when I actually started talking to people and would sit at the table with them and hear their story or have them come into my home mm-hmm. and be with my family and just listen and be there and let them tell me what they wanted to tell me in the time that they wanted to tell me. And
absolutely.
That's what changes you. Mm-hmm. That is why it became a passion to me and a calling, because I'm like, I know Jesus would be taking time for every one of these people, every one of these women.
Yeah.
He would sit as long as they needed to. That's what he did with the Samaritan woman, right? Mm-hmm. He mm-hmm. went and set himself beside a well and waited for her to come.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And that should be an encouragement, frankly, to all of your listeners who may be sitting with the idea. So let's imagine, here's this woman, maybe she's your age, she's raised her kids and she's wondering what's the next chapter, and I still have love to give and I still have energy and I want to do something meaningful with my life. But then what starts to creep in are all of the you don't haves.
Yes.
Right? But you don't have a degree. But right. You don't have this. But you don't, right? It doesn't matter.
It doesn't.
Right? As we started, even just in my credentials, those all came after I was thrown into the work, right? And so that adage of not calling the prepared, but preparing the called.
Yeah.
It's empirically true for me.
Yeah. I'm sure that was speaking to a lot of my listeners. So can you talk a little bit about residential care?
Sure.
What do you think would be important for us to know about survivor care and residential care?
Well, one, I think it's very important for people to understand if you don't have issues like addiction in your family, mm-hmm. Then we sometimes have a simplistic and maybe too much of a Western American idea of, just fix it. Like if we just send her to a program, yeah. She'll be fixed and she'll be fine.
It's all magical after that, right?
It's Jiffy Lube, right? Can we make it fast? Can we make it a drive-through? Mm-hmm. Can we just turn transformational change into fast food? Yeah. But this is a long journey. Mm-hmm. Again, we may be going all the way back to some very early wounds of that person. And we have to understand that residential care often takes different shapes. And so we call it the continuum of care. And to just briefly go over that continuum, think a clothesline where there's different stages along that line. At the very front end, you've got those outreaches, just like I had with the Korean Presbyterians. But these are the people like Scarlet Hope here in Kentucky who's going into the clubs, right?
Yes.
And people that are going online, people that are going even into the schools, right? And so folks who are going out to the battlefield and they are literally trying to find the wounded. Then we've got emergency, and that would be probably what we over Hollywood, right? The rescue narrative of like, let's go snatch this person and we've got to put him in hiding.
There's a nice adrenaline.
It is, but it's largely phantasmagorical and not reality.
Yes.
But there is a place for, okay, we've apprehended this 17-year-old, or we don't know how old she is. We got to put her someplace for 48 hours because we got to figure out, is she an adult? Is she a minor? Does she belong here? Is she from Kentucky? Where does she go? Right? So that's buying time. That's emergency. That could be happening in a hotel, an apartment, somebody's house, whatever. That's very, very short term. Then we have stabilization. And I want your audience to understand that stabilization is in such ambivalence. This is where the survivor is really teetering on those big questions of, is there help for me? Can I do this? Do they mean it? I've tried this 6 times. Am I just going to go back, right? Stabilization is anywhere from 30 to 90 days. And it is, here's the way you can imagine it. This is the way we talk about it. She's in a snow globe and it's still shaking. And all you see is the snow. You don't have a clear picture of who she is. She can't see her way out of it. It's chaos. And we have got to have a tolerance for the fact that that phase is necessary. So until we get to some measure of safety, then we see the proverbial snow start to settle. Then we hope we move into long-term care, some of what Refuge for Women does, right? Long-term care, that's the piece that everybody on the outside wants to happen immediately, right? Can't we get her a job? Can't we get her to go to school? Why isn't she doing her own laundry? Well, because we got to go through these early phases first. And so things have got to settle before we have an idea of who she really is and what we need to do to best care for that individual, male or female. Then what we're seeing is probably the fastest growing part of our sector is the latter phases. So you have adult children, you now realize they don't always leave.
No.
Right?
Or they come back.
Or they're sort of like, oh my gosh, I'm having a meltdown because my car had a flat tire and you never taught me how to change the... Take that times 10. And so that's a very fragile time that after I've completed this recovery, I'm kind of like that proverbial senior in high school who's supposed to be taking steps into adulthood, but I'm very unsure about those steps. And that's why we've seen such an increase in what we call transitional housing, where it's 1 foot in and 1 foot out. They're still connected to a community. They still have supportive services. It's almost like, I got you if you fall, but I'm going to let you try to walk on your own. And then beyond that would be what we see more in the addiction space, like the AA, NA, Celebrate Recovery, where, hey, I'm 10 years in recovery, but I still go to group. Right? I still reconnect with my counselor. I still, need that touch point to soften the rough edges, stay connected to community. So that's the spectrum, and residential care falls in those middle zones, but it looks different based on where the survivor is in that trajectory.
Yeah, you really need to, I think it's a challenge because I remember when I first started volunteering with Refuge for Women, and I was, we had this long-term program, and the ideal would be to walk with a woman for about a year and then, be a part of her life in the transition after the program. And that always didn't go well. And, there's and as a volunteer, I know that because it happened to me too. Like I got wounded that way because
Sure.
it's painful. It's painful. You've spent one day a week in my case, and then you've thought like she's just going to be able to soar now. But it's just not as easy to soar. It's just kind of like how you compared it to even just having adult children that, they may go to college and then they may come back. Or they may, and then, just this kind of this ping pong of like still trying to. And I can relate with my kids because, they came from a stable family. But if you never had a stable family.
Right.
And it's a lot harder.
You're starting with more deficits.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, you can think of that metaphoric, your hole is deeper. You've got further to climb out.
Yeah.
And so it's going to take longer. Our longest standing survivor in our program was 7 years.
Yeah.
But she came to us with nothing, no resources, no family, no going back to anything. And so, try to imagine, and this is a bizarre comparison, but it's contemporary. Right now we're looking at hundreds of people in California who have lost everything. So imagine that your life is at a zero and you have to start completely over. But the advantage, oddly enough, that the folks in California have is they at least know the life they're going towards.
Right.
Survivors often don't. One of the things that's so curious is they would, they call those of us who are not exploited squares, right? And so they'd say, Miss Jeanne, I know I want to be a square. I want to be like you. I want to fit into your world, but I don't understand your world at all. You talk about things like having dinner with your family.
Yeah.
I don't even know how to do that.
Yes.
And so she's coming from much, much further behind. Her zero is complete zero. And that we have to just have a greater patience. And so when as you've illustrated, we get this impatience as volunteers.
I know.
Like, you should be so much further along. Goodness gracious, you're 24 years old.
Or you're 42.
Or you're 42, right? But functionally, she's 18.
Yeah, or younger. Yeah. And I hope that helps people who want to volunteer, who might feel that nudge to want to serve and to go into the trenches, so to speak, to not let our expectations and our worldview, which is completely different.
Yeah, I'll tell you, the absolute best volunteer we ever had was a middle-aged woman who had raised her 2 sons. They were off to college. She was coming from a position of affluence, and she came into my office and she goes, I have nothing to offer. She goes, I have this spoiled life. Everything's gone well for me. I don't understand these women at all. I have no degrees in anything. I have nothing. And I started asking her questions like, well, are your kids in jail? No. Are your kids strung out on drugs? No. Do you have a good marriage? Yes. Right? I'm like, you might be the most qualified person ever, because what we miss sometimes is these individuals are trying to change their lives to something they can't imagine. So what we have to give them is a model of what could be.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Right? I've had so many survivors say, and let this be controversial because it is, we talk a lot about how we need to be survivor-led and survivor-infused, and survivors have to be leading other survivors. But when you listen to survivors in programs, they will tell you, I don't need anybody to show me where I've been. I need somebody to show me where I want to go. I believe the right answer is a both and.
Yeah.
But we too quickly negate that Lexington, Kentucky housewife who knows how to say no to her children because she knows it's in the best interest of their growth, who knows how to pick her battles, who knows how to deflect and say, that's your problem, that's not about me, right? Who knows how to say, I will sit with you for as long as it takes, right? Your tears don't have to be mine, but I'm still here, right? Those life lessons are the most valuable credentials. We would hire that over anybody with initials after your name. And I say that as somebody with a bunch of initials, but I'm going to tell you, much, much more valuable are the dispositional characteristics of somebody who can say, I can sit with another person, just like we were talking about earlier. Those qualified moms who aren't looking to smother anybody,
Right.
but qualified because they've raised their kids well and they've launched them, because that's what we're doing again.
Yeah.
You are helping in some ways attend to those deficits
Yeah.
so that they launch. You know, when we now train shelter providers across the U.S., and so we work with hundreds of shelters and particularly their new staff coming in and whatnot. And we make them at the beginning of a training say one mantra. And I say, every single woman who walks in the door, your first thought needs to be, she's leaving. If that's not your first and ever-present thought, you are going to do wrong in this work. If you think, I'm going to love up on her, then it's already about you.
Yeah.
But if you can say she's leaving, and your second is, how do I help her leave well? That's what we have to do with our children.
Yeah.
They're leaving.
You're training them to
Right?
You're
I'm not
raising
buying a
them to
house
leave.
next door so that they stay here forever.
Yeah.
You are helping them launch. And so if you can approach the work that way with that kind of disposition, which is why, a healthy maternal impulse is really effective in this work.
Gosh, Jeanne, that was so wise. That was just really, I know you just flipped a bunch of tables for my listeners, because you just took all their excuses away and you reset our heart on how we should go into this. I wish you had been in my life in 2012 when I first started this.
Oh my goodness.
Because you would have been able to speak. Would you have known that to speak that in 2012?
I was on the journey.
Yeah.
I was on the journey. I would say it's refined now. And I think that that's also part of, the work that God has. It was hard for me to leave direct service. It really was.
Yeah.
Because you do become so enmeshed in the work, and you get a little drunk on the adrenaline of it.
Yeah.
And so you asked me before we started about my move from Baltimore to Kentucky, which was, we'll say in small t, traumatic, because I went from total chaos. It was 24/7 for 13 straight years.
Yeah.
I lived 4 minutes from the shelter home, so I was always there for every crisis. I was hands-on 24/7 for 13 straight years. And so that's a tremendous expenditure of energy. And then when we created the Institute and decided to relocate here to the greater Louisville area, it was a huge culture shock. And God just went me from 150 miles an hour down to like speed limits 30. Right? And now 3 years in, it's lovely.
Yeah.
And we enjoy it. But it is really hard leaving that chaos. But here's the point. It's not exclusively about me. It's what is God doing on me that teaches me about the work? That is exactly what is happening with our survivors.
Yeah.
They've been in chaos for how long? They know chaos. They're comfortable in chaos, right? The idea that I can quickly respond to anything you're going to throw at me, this is my skill set. These are my wiles. And so that's where I had competency. Now here I am out in the burbs where people are super polite and not cussing at each
Very
other.
Southern,
I don't know what's going on. Everybody wants to ask about my family and have me over for dinner, and it's just wild.
Yeah.
But it's at a totally different pace, totally different rhythm, and I get to experience that fish out of water. But now now it makes sense. You said earlier it's so hard because sometimes you see them leave.
Yeah.
And we always want to ask, why do they leave? Why do they go back? Right? Well, we say flippantly, well, it's the devil you know versus the one you don't.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's the chaos you're comfortable in. If I've known chaos since 13, that's where I thrive. That's where I have skills. It's so interesting. I've had survivors say to me, I was good in the life.
Yeah.
It was something I was good at. And now I'm trying to do your world, and I'm not good at any of it.
Yeah.
And every one of us can relate to the feeling of incompetence, because that's what she's saying to me. I feel incompetent. And when we feel incompetent, we're disincented to move forward. Right?
Yeah.
So it makes perfect sense
It really does.
for her to say, I know this isn't socially acceptable, but as I've heard far too many times, when I'm getting raped at home, I'm not worth anything. But at least out there, there's a price tag on my tail. At least I'm worth something. At least somebody wants me.
Yeah.
And we have to not be quick to dismiss that and realize that's a very natural human condition to say, I want a place where I belong. I want a place where I fit in. There's the chaos I'm comfortable with, and I'm going to gravitate towards that.
Yeah.
And so that's part of when we look at behaviors that are baffling. I'll tell you, just to make a theological connection, we talk in our training about the importance of paying attention to, in John 5, where the man is approaching Jesus is approaching the man who has been paralyzed,
Yeah.
right, on his mat for 37 years, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And when he says, do you want to be healed? The man immediately goes into this litany of deflections.
Yes, he does.
Right? And you look at that and you go, that makes no sense. This is your chance.
You just won the lottery, sir.
Right? This makes no sense. Mm-hmm. Why would you go off on all of that nonsense? Right? Because being on that mat's what he knows. Right? That's his comfortable chaos.
It is.
It's harder to leave that than than we estimate. And so I think that has been, even looking at my, playful little example of moving to Grange from downtown Baltimore.
Yeah.
Versus somebody who is leaving the chaos of criminality and addiction and exploitation to their Grange. Like, I don't know how to do that.
Yeah, I love how you use that John 5, because I didn't understand that fully until I started traveling to Israel and studying there. And when I take people to that spot and I teach that lesson, I'm like, that perplexes us so much because it doesn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. But he's never had a job. He's never had to support, begging is a way that he is able to support himself. But now Jesus is saying, are you ready for what's coming next? Because now you're going to actually have to get a job.
Right. And
you're not young anymore.
Right.
And you have to learn a new skill, and you have to do, and it is it's so compassionate of Jesus to not just barge in and heal him and turn his life upside down, but to ask him, are you ready to do what it's going to take?
Yeah.
To step into the healing that I can give you.
Well, and we use that passage back on the caregivers too.
Yes.
And say, when you are upset because she left and she went back, and you don't understand, she wasn't ready yet.
She wasn't.
She wasn't ready yet. And that's not our timing.
It isn't. No, I just had to walk through that same heartbreak again. I've done it many, many times, over and over and over, as I'm sure you have. But this young woman, and she's like 22. She's like the age of one of my kids. Mm-hmm. And, she's living in a transitional living apartment, and she has a job, and she's, working towards her GED. And then she just spiraled, and just like she couldn't handle the quiet. Mm-hmm. She's like, so she stepped back into chaos.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to stop praying for her and believing God that God will bring her back.
Right.
And then the next time she'll be ready.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is where the long view is so important.
It is.
And recognizing that, all right, you watered.
Yeah.
But you didn't get the harvest.
No.
And that's okay. Because the next time she goes around and she ends up at a program in Ohio or who knows where, she will reflect on, hey, you know what? I was able to do it for 7 months.
Yeah.
Maybe this time I can go 9 or 12 or 40 or whatever. Uh-huh. And so that is also a part of our Christian discipline.
It is.
Is to understand it's a relay race and you get a piece of it. I had a survivor who very, very early on, she was brilliant, one of my teachers, and she put her little finger in my face and she said, don't you ever take credit. Don't you ever take credit for anybody who walks out of here, quote unquote, graduated, because you don't know how many people before you did the work.
She was a teacher, wasn't she?
She was genius. She still is genius.
Yeah, that's incredible. Well, Jeanne, this has been such a good conversation. If you'll give me a couple more minutes, talk to the moms. We've talked to the middle-aged women in my audience, but let's talk to the young moms who have 7 and 8 year old kids, who have kids moving towards middle school and high school, and undo some of the myths.
Yeah.
There's some myths that they believe.
Yeah, well, at the risk of ending on a downer.
I know, it'll be a little.
But let's just throw some truth bombs, because that's part of, of speaking the truth. I think that if I had a 7 or 8 year old child right now, boy or girl, that having the mindset of the fact that I have a teen socially, not developmentally, but what your generation of teen had exposure to is now what we are putting in front of 5, 6, 7, 8 year olds. In the United States, the average age of introduction to porn is 7. And they are not seeing Playboy magazine.
No.
What they are seeing is violent and graphic and obscene and degrading to humans, to each other. So we have to understand they don't even have the brain capacity to process this. You see in the news across the country, the curriculum that are going in schools right here in the Commonwealth, right, where we've agreed by omission or commission that certain content will be in our libraries for children. There's a whole host of content now that children have access to through their schools, through their libraries, that is unimaginable. There's things that have happened here in Kentucky. And honestly, when I left Maryland, I thought, oh, I'm coming down here. It's 78% Christian. It's going to be a breath of fresh air. Right. But we've got sex camps for kids, right? Where here in Kentucky, you can send your children off to, you call a youth camp, but it's sex camp taught by self-admitted witches. And that's here in Kentucky.
You're blowing my mind right now. I did not even know that.
Oh, my goodness. There's so much. Kentucky's one of the first states in the union to outlaw sex dolls, because that's a thing now, because you can buy them on Amazon, right? And so you don't even have to have a human being. So I'm not straying from kids. I want to stay focused on, I want moms of younger kids to wake up. I don't want you to think about your mop's reality. I want you to imagine, I've got a 7-year-old girl, but I have to protect her as if I've got a 13-year-old girl. I've got to have that kind of rigor, and I have to understand that the social forces that are bearing down on her are as if she has a smartphone at 7 or 8 years old. You have opened her up to every predator in the globe. In the globe. There are studies now out that say that 30% of children who meet somebody online will meet them in person.
Wow.
Will walk out of their home, and this has nothing to do with affluence or geography or anything.
Right.
30% of kids will accept an offer to, hey, meet me at the mall or whatever.
Yeah.
So we have to understand that it's a different ball game, and we can't cup our ears and say, well, I'm not technical, or, well, we go to church.
That won't do it. That's
because
not enough.
We've got 68% of youth pastors are addicted to porn.
Yeah.
So these are just, unfortunately, the realities, the truth bombs that say they're your children, but the landscape has changed. You're not raising them in Mayberry, RFD, or LaGrange, Kentucky.
Right.
You are now raising them in your idea of downtown Detroit. So you got to respond as if that's the case. And that means that if you have to compromise some things to be more diligent or schooled. Now, on the upside, because it is so ubiquitous, all of the content that's coming at our kids all the time, you should be much more comfortable about approaching your children and say, hey, have you ever heard this thing about, right? Have you ever heard the word grooming What do
Yeah.
you think that word means?
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever heard the word predator? What do you think that means? That's kind of a grown-up word. What do you think that means, right? And you can have these conversations, and you should be
Yeah, they should
having
be.
these conversations. You know, it still is true that the single strongest protective measure for a child is one safe adult in their life, whether that's mom or dad. But I do, if you'll let me, want to say something particularly to dads.
Please do.
70% of our survivors over a 13-year period grew up with no father in the home.
Mm-hmm.
It is absolute fallacy to say that they're afraid of men.
Yeah.
They're not.
They're not.
It is poppycock to say you can't say Jesus as male or God the Father. That's all a lie.
Mm-hmm.
Because what you learn by actually doing life with these individuals is there is actually a hole in their heart that has never been filled.
Right.
And they are desperate to know what that looks like. I once had it was a profound moment where the ladies in our household, and we would average about 11 at any one time, and I got questions like, Miss Jeanne, you're always talking so favorably about your dad. What's it like to grow up with one?
Yeah.
Okay, after you stop crying, then you realize there's a hunger there, there's a deficit there, and I can do something. I can't give her a dad, but I'm going to go find some. So I went to the churches in our community and I said, give me your dads. I want your dads.
Yeah, I love that.
Right? I know. It sounds very creepy. Right?
No, it's bold.
But I said, give me your dads. We're going to do a thing. So I sat down with my ladies and we had a number of conversations about things that dads teach daughters.
Yeah.
Man stuff that girls should know.
Right.
And we put together a series of weekends where we would get a group full of dads who would come in, and one was just a workshop, a 2-hour workshop on cars.
Yeah.
What's a dipstick? How do you change a tire? How do you do a flare? All the dad stuff. And all they did was came in and they just, today we're doing cars. 2 Saturdays later, we're going to do all things with fire. What's a pilot light, right? What does gas smell like? How do you, et cetera, right? Light a campfire. All the things.
Yeah.
This was their long list of this is what dads do. So we tried to fill a void, but I'm going to tell you this, Julie. The people most changed were the dads.
Of course they were.
They didn't know that going in.
Of course not.
They went in saying, okay, I'm going to do this thing. I know how to light a campfire. I'm going to teach, right? And they walked out of there positively wrecked because they said, that girl looks like my daughter.
Yeah.
That girl's the same age as, right? And they walked out of there and they realized, I am closer to this problem than I realize. But it gave them the opportunity to say, you know what? I just spent 2 hours or a weekend or a Saturday or whatever with this group of women. And now I can go home and take my 13-year-old daughter who's grumpy and sullen in her room, and we can go to Chick-fil-A and have a conversation. And the door opener is, let me tell you about my day. Let me tell you about the people I met today. And maybe that's going to be what God's going to use to unlock what they perceive to be their relational distance. That ripple effect is what we have to put in motion by somebody, whether it's me or you or whoever, going, give me your dads.
Yeah.
We're going to solve a problem, but it's going to be a seed planted.
Yeah.
That's going to produce great fruit.
Yeah, that's incredible. I think that I have people who will say, this is a women's ministry issue, that women's ministry should be recruiting these middle-aged women to go and serve, but we need the men's ministry to be involved in this, right?
Absolutely.
We need them to show up. I need them to show up to my farm in central Kentucky, and do some of the things that you were just talking about.
We had a pretty large property too, and we had one particular group of men from inner city Black Baptist, or AME, I think, but all guys. And they said, look, we don't want to do anything to disrupt the women, but can we pray? Of course. Yeah. Well, can we pray on property?
Yeah.
We're like, oh, that's interesting. So they would come out once a month and they just prayer walked around the perimeter.
Yeah.
And they would do that for about an hour and then they'd leave. But here's what they didn't see. From inside the house, the women have their little faces glued to the window.
They're watching.
They're watching
and learning.
And they're turning to me and they're going, Miss Jeanne, why would they do that?
Yeah, why?
Why would they do that for me? Maybe some of those men look like somebody who hurt them.
Yeah.
And now they see somebody who looks like somebody who hurt them act in their best interest in a redemptive way and say, they are putting you before the Lord.
Yeah.
And they're like, it's mind-blowing, but it's delightful. Those are the best moments of shelter care, when you can go, this is probably jacking with everything that you've ever thought, and it's beautiful.
It's table flipping.
It's table flipping.
Exactly. And that's what we want our audience to latch onto, is all of the table flipping things that you have said in this conversations. You have talked to middle-aged women, you have talked to moms and dads, and now you've talked to the men who are on the sidelines thinking they only see me as a predator. But that's not true.
It's the role you choose, right?
Yeah.
You choose to be a protector. You choose to be a teacher.
Yeah.
You choose to be whatever. I wish more shelters would, and I would say a good number of them do intentionally engage men, but we have to be creative. We have to think out of the box, and we have to drop some of these myths, these presumptions that we have. Because remember what I said about she's leaving?
Yeah.
That is your first and ever-present thought. And you are sending her back out into a world that's 49% male.
Yeah.
So if we take her into a protective all-female bubble, we're not helping her.
No, we're not. We're not preparing her for the real world.
We're not preparing her. And when you sit with the women and you realize, I want to be married. I want to have a husband who loves me. I have a son. How can I be a good mom to a boy? Right? These are their real questions.
Yeah, they are real questions. And how to be a daughter.
Right.
And how to, like, it's one thing to have a woman come alongside and mentor you, but if you have like a man who fills another void, that brings this completeness and this wholeness into the story.
Yeah, we had a number of pastors who would come in and do Bible study for our ladies. And so if anybody was, let's say that they were hurt in the church, how redemptive to now have the pastor come on your territory, in your environment, and do what he's supposed to do, right? Bring you the word, but on your terms.
Yeah.
That's a bridge.
It is a bridge.
It's a beautiful one.
It's a bridge to get people back to church, which I know, and we can, we just don't have time to talk about the wonderful study that you all did on survivors choosing faith-based organizations. And there was some really encouraging data that came out of that.
Yeah. We did a lengthy survey of about 158 survivors who'd been in programs to ask them about it. And just ever so briefly, but all of your listeners can go online and download it for free.
Yes.
And we learned that 75% of survivors chose to go into a faith-based program for one of two reasons. They either wanted to reclaim the faith of their youth, or they wanted to become a person of faith. And as I've said a number of times, we asked them another question about what of any faith practices was helpful to your healing. And my favorite quote out of the whole study was someone who said Bible study was the most effective. And her answer was, because in the Bible, I found out that there were as many people as screwed up as I am.
Oh, that's so good.
Isn't that beautiful? That's poetry right there.
It really is. I read through that study, and we will link it in our show notes.
Good.
And we will link your website. And I know you have a big conference coming up. Do you want to plug that?
So in Louisville, so this will be at the Blank and Baker campus of Southeast in end of March, so March 30 to April 2nd. We are hosting the first National Christian Conference on Sexual Exploitation to represent that whole continuum of care. It is primarily for people who are in some service capacity, but we are also opening it up to people who want to move into this field. It's probably not your introduction, because we're going to be at, we're not at a 100 level course. We're probably at a 200, 300 level. But if you're in the work, or want to go deeper into the work, this is the company of people from across the United States who are committed to the anti-trafficking movement to the glory of God.
Yeah, I know that we have our Refuge for Women team coming on the national level and our local level. So, Jeanne, thank you for all that you are doing.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you for having this conversation with me and opening eyes and flipping tables.
Amen.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Friends, as we like to say around here, I'm going to not do a bright spot like we normally do, because I think what she shared about the good news that's coming out of survivors about their view on the faith community, I think that's a bright spot. That was a bright spot for me, because we talked to people, and I know in our listening audience that there are many of you who have church hurt and have left the church for various reasons. And I just want you to know that some of the people that you think would be the most unlikely to show up at a church are the people who are turning to the church, turning to people of faith. So that's going to be our collective bright spot for this episode. Until the next time, keep following the table flipper, but leave the table flipping to Jesus.